You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
I'm here, guys. Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Get ready to go against the grain. We have another great show for you today. I have been up early, believe it or not, since yesterday, but I am energized by the frenzy of collective action that is taking place across the United States and across the world. In the first hour, we'll be discussing the mass protests continuing to grow and sweep in the big cities and small towns across America, including the savage violence visited upon protesters in Seattle by the police force. Nevertheless, despite the violence, those protests are getting people to listen. A couple of days ago, the New York Times ran an article on defunding the police. Shocking to see that headline on the pages of the New York Times. We'll be discussing what that means and what are the alternatives to the current version of maintaining order. A little bit later, we'll play the poll guessing game. Now, you can follow along as Bob puts his perspective of the world that he has in his head, up against what the public is thinking from CNN's recent poll. I will give you a hint. This poll is looking ghastly for one Donald Trump. In the second hour, we'll discuss the living picture of irony, one Colin Powell, given his reason for not voting for Trump. You're going to love that. We'll also discuss Biden's attempt to co-opt the energy of the Black Lives Matter protests as he consolidates his position after winning the nomination over the weekend. Last but not least, it's Monday. That means Miss the Press, the segment where Bob gets to lampoon the Sunday morning talking heads, the things they say and the things that they bury. This is always a funny segment. But let's start here. People are flinging their bodies into the streets. Rejoice! I was one of those people over the weekend. Those protests have swept all across big cities and small towns in every state of this nation, with the majority of the public accepting and supporting the premise by the tune of 80%. 84 to be exact. Also, the protests are not just here, but those protests are around the world. Sydney, Germany, the UK, yanked down the statue of a slave trader and chucked him into the ocean. It is astonishing, the frenzy and the energy. It's energetic, it's amazing, it's profound. What, may I ask, is so fundamentally broken with your world that all of these people around the world will take the energy to go out into a hot day and to walk and to chant and to get across, anchor and discuss? I strongly suspect that many of the people in the streets are supplanting their own feelings of disgust with what they experience as needlessly oppressive society, with the inciting incident that took place with Floyd. Basically, there are intersecting concerns that are bringing these people out to the protests, even though they may not be able to articulate it in very specific terms. The disgust of many is basically representing a catastrophe of one. The operative question is, why are police necessary in the first place? Meaning, what was the logic that incentivized your society to put that cop there to be on that guy's neck in the first place? We have 5% of the world's population. 25% of that world's population's in our prisons. China has 3 times our our population and less people in our jails. Put that in perspective. You have to engage that. Why? Your society never asked the question of what it's doing to create so many people that are breaking its rules. The judge wags his finger, calls that individual bad names, and sends him away. Brings in the next person and does the exact same thing. The question is, what is your society doing? That person wasn't born that way. Something of him interacted with something in your culture, the general incentives in your system, the conditions in some communities that provoke the requirement for a menacing device to keep order. What is wrong with your world? One factor, if I may add, that seems to be prevalent in this is poverty. The police aren't criminalizing the rich or the upper middle class. Let's deal with the poverty and talk about the remaining spots of crime as the cops are defunded and replace this unnecessary. It also must be understood that the police are there for order, not justice. They're not heroes in this. Whether that's maintaining slavery, Jim Crow, apartheid, the slaughter of Native Americans, the shoveling of 95% of the income gains to the top 1%, the savagely brutalizing of the indigenous population in Standing Rock. They're the poor that are paid to police the other poor. Allows that small, tiny segment to maintain their profits and allows systems to remain in place that allow them to expropriate more. That's what they are. The issue is inequality. The amount of energy that it takes to maintain the level of inequality in your system is basically the cops. That's what that thin blue line is. The truth of the matter is that your society makes a political choice to allow some in your society to wallow in poverty while a small segment lives in opulence. The ethereal friction created from that gut level understood injustice creates a force, or that creates an energy or potential energy that requires a force to keep your system in place. Otherwise, the poor would create an army and descend on Beverly Hills. My point is that your issue is inequality. That cop is there because your political system has made the choice not to invest in resources necessary to eliminate the need for those cops, instead preferring to allow Jeff Bezos to be the first trillionaire. That should be appalling. That should be appalling to you. Jeff Bezos does not exist without those workers in his stores, in his factories, or for that matter, people buying his products, without you paying for those cops to be on the streets or the firefighters to be on that street. That warehouse burned down. There was a fire department that went to put out the fire at that warehouse. That was us. That was our public will. I'm making a point that this guy should not be a billionaire, let alone a trillionaire. And the notion that he did it by himself, but any of these guys did it by himself, when it takes workers and human beings and all sorts of a society to allow him to do that, it's obscene for us to even have to make the argument that he shouldn't be a trillionaire, or for that matter, a billionaire. And yet, here we are. You have people living on the street and other people stepping over them to get in their limos. Those people are out in the streets because they recognize on either a gut or intellectual level that the things that they require, the things that they want, the things that they need in real terms are not offered by the political device. The political device is an imaginary thing. Their needs are very real, and they get that, in which case they take their issue to the streets. Put it in perspective. Medicare for All has 88% approval, nearly unanimous appreciation. It was weighed in the fires of debate and won for over a year, and it won. Nevertheless, Pelosi put up what? Cobra. Put up Cobra. 88% support from the Democratic Party, 70% support from the majority of the public. That's just one issue. And the political device that is supposed to be dealing with the real concerns of the public says kick rocks. Joe Biden goes to the point and says, if it was put up, if it passed the House and the Senate, I will still tell you to kick rocks. What is the public to do in that situation? Their needs are not being met by the political system. The political system, again, is an imaginary thing. What the people need is a real thing. And the people, when what they need is not being made in the political device, they go outside of it. Why shouldn't they do that? You're breaking the social contract the moment that you ignore the will of the public. The public has no other recourse than to do what the public did. There will be people who will listen at some point to the public's will, people who are in politics. And those people will have a job to do, such as AOC. I want to get the public's will done. And the dinosaurs in the party say, no. Logically, AOC says, we need to primary some folks because I can't get my job done. I'm telling my constituents that I'm going to get a Medicare for all. I can't do that. I can't do that. The dinosaurs are there. The Democratic Party says, we don't want you to get rid of our dinosaurs. So the DSCC and the DCCC basically said, if you help any of these people to try to get rid of one of these dinosaurs, we are going to sanction you, meaning blackmail you. We're not going to allow you to blackball you. We're not going to allow you to use our stuff. This is utterly astonishing. Now, the problem here is lefties are still trying to get in. And one of those lefties has just gotten an endorsement of one AOC. Now, one Representative Engel, dinosaur, been there for 16 years, doesn't like the fact that he got the endorsement. Let's hear the clip of Engel complaining about the dictatorship of AOC.
This is not a dictatorship. This is the democracy. We shouldn't have one person from high, even though she's a colleague of mine, think that she can anoint whoever is elected to Congress. That's not what democracy is all about. So I'm tried and true. I've been there. I've worked hard. I've done things for people. As I said to people, 2-year term, I asked for a renewal of my contract for another 2 years.
How sad is that? A dictatorship. What are you talking about? A dictatorship. She gives him an endorsement. She's perfectly legitimate to give him an endorsement. And by the way, both of you guys are just representatives. She's not above you in no real terms. Endorsement. And by the way, you can't complain about that considering Obama basically shoved Sanders out the race. Obama and Clinton chose Keith Ellison and this guy, Steny Hoyer. Let's play this clip right now.
You would like me to get out of the race.
Exactly, like you get out. And of course, that's correct.
Yeah. I know you're fundraising for Crow.
Yeah.
You know?
I'm for Crow. I am for Crow because the judgment was made very early on. And it just phased the decision.
So your position is a decision was made, very early on before voters had to say, that's fine because that's the DCCC knows better than the voters of the 6th Congressional District, and we should line up behind that candidate.
That's certainly the consequence of our decision. There are two things I'd like you to consider. One may be easier than the other. First would be,
okay, it's hard to hear this gentleman, but basically this is Steny Hoyer telling the man to get out the race. We've already chosen our candidate. Don't tell me that this woman is a dictatorship because she gives an endorsement. You guys have had all sorts of asserting control. You've been there for 16 years. This is not about an endorsement. There are people who want things. The political device is not giving them, and you're part of that political device. Get out the way. Bob, I know it was hard to hear, but Steny Hoyer was basically telling the gentleman, we've already chose our candidate, get out the race.
Yeah, I mean, I think people... Well, first of all, let me say welcome back to Political Misfits here to all of our listeners. Thank you for being with us on the top of the show on Monday. I mean, it seems like time is all blurred into just kind of one confusing moment right now, Jamal, as we think about the protest over the last few weeks here and how they kind of start to bleed together as people continue out every single day, which is quite remarkable. Yeah, I mean, to your point, we're at a real inflection point within the national politics where more and more people from the left are going to challenge the Steny Hoyers and the Engels of the world. And hopefully these people leave office. I think we're seeing mass movements in the street by a lot of young people who've been completely disenfranchised by the political system. We talked about this when Bernie Sanders was winning state after state with the young vote, the young black vote. And now those people are not going to turn to Joe Biden. They're going to look elsewhere. And this is what we've been saying. Is it going to be a social movement or is it an economic movement? And we've been talking that on Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik for quite a while now. We've been ahead of the curve on talking about these protests growing as they are, Jamal, and you're going to see more people feeding off of the movement and then going into the electoral space. And these older white males predominantly are going to basically feel that pressure, and they're going to start to snowflake a little bit. Like, how dare you? I've worked so hard for this seat. Does no one no, we don't appreciate you, because right now we're in a mess of a capitalistic system that is oppressing people, and people have gone out on the streets and shown that they're not going to stand for it. They're going to fight back against it. They're going to get very loud. They're going to amplify their call because it's got to a choke point, Jamal. And I think that's what was remarkable about this inflection point. And I'm grateful and thankful that you played those two clips to show these old white men who have plenty of money, plenty of clout, plenty of wealth. They've been in office for plenty of time, completely melting down like small children now that anybody would possibly run against them. Jamal Thomas, let's get into our second hour of news today. We have a fantastic show ahead of us. We'll take our first break of the hour here. After the break, we'll get into our first hour. We'll be talking about the latest traumas created by American racism and American imperialism at home and abroad, the latest poll numbers around Donald Trump's handling of the U.S. protests, and the latest revelation on how Western organizations contributed to the coup of Evo Morales in Bolivia late last year. And if that is not enough, don't you worry, Misfits. We have a second hour for you after that. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in D.C. We're back after this.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people.
where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to cash them out,
we actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Political Misfits.
Political Misfits who?
Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik.
Not ringing a bell, sorry.
News, politics, culture, cutting through the red and blue spin to get to the real story. From noon to 2 p.m. Eastern at 105.5 in Washington, D.C.
Oh, it's Bob and Jamaro. Of course, come on in.
Aren't you glad we didn't say MSNBC?
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, the show that goes against the grain. I'm Bob Schlehuber here, sort of kind of with Jamarl Thomas. Jamarl, I'm excited to be back here. A brand new week of shows ahead for you all listeners out there from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Give us a call, anything on your mind, 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. Hopefully you're listening to us on 105.5 FM here in the nation's capital. You could also be listening to us at many different places. So don't worry if you're not able to get to the radio. You can check us out on SputnikNews.com. You can check us out on the fantastic YouTube channel Progressive Soapbox. You get to see Jamarl's beautiful face there on the streaming video, and occasionally a photo or two of me just to show that I'm still alive and well. Proof of life there, Jamarl Thomas. And if you're not able to catch us live during the day, you can always download our show on podcast platforms across the world wide webs, wherever you listen to them. Jamarl, I know you had a chance there to get out onto the streets. Quite exciting times, exciting, also horrific, quite scary.
Yes.
Kind of curious what you had the chance to see this weekend, and tell me a little bit more. I think we wanted to play the polling guessing game here with me.
Yes.
Some of the national sentiments. I would just kind of love how you're feeling about stuff, but then we can get into the broader American populace.
I am excited. This is radicalizing me in a weird way, right? Like, when Donald Trump comes out and makes that unhinged speech, my thought is, you got to throw your bodies on the street. That's unacceptable for a president to do. And this goes to this whole thing of, Parliament versus the king. Which one has authority per se? When the king goes out of whack, well, Parliament has to take control. I guess I'm looking at it as from the standpoint of the public, the political system has failed to deliver what they wanted. Like, think back to what a Democrat was, Jack Kennedy. And right now, you have Joe Biden and Donald Trump as your two people going after one another. And you ask, wait a minute. How did this happen? Like, you can look at what the public wanted, and then you look at the political system and say, that in no way distributes that. It's such, it's so weird. I felt great about it. I say it that way. That's all. I felt great. It felt good to get out there. Bob?
Cautious. There are ways to go to these large protests and stay at a distance or stay to the side. There are ways to stay safe and mindful while you're there. So we encourage folks to continue to express themselves. Jamarl, we do have our guest on the line here to continue to talk about the intersection between the coronavirus pandemic and the ever-growing protest here in the United States against police brutality and racism. Here to talk about this intersection and much more is Dr. Joseph Richardson, professor of African American Studies and Medical Anthropology at the University of Maryland, College Park, and the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Dr. Richardson, welcome to the show.
Ask him again.
Dr. Richardson, are you here with us?
Thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks for being with us, Dr. Richardson. Let me just start here by asking how you are doing. You're somebody who studies violence, trauma, and the intersection of public health and the justice systems. I'm curious how you are doing and what are your thoughts at this moment?
I have a lot of thoughts, but I would definitely say is I think we are at the point of time where we need to revisit not just engaging in incremental reform of the institutions in America, which kind of control the narrative on policing, but leaning more towards more radical and revolutionary change of what we envision these institutions looking like as we move forward, and envisioning what a new society or a new America would look like as we move towards kind of reinventing and deconstructing and reconstructing new institutions throughout the country.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the conversation the last week or two has really been about people seemingly not understanding the difference between systems and structures, and people saying that structural change would be some type of reform to policing, which is going to miss the mark. But Dr. Richardson, I did want to ask you a little bit more about trauma and your studies on the intersection of public health and justice systems, just to ground our conversation. I had two moments this last week that gave maybe even the slightest slightest insight into the Black experience in the U.S. And I say sliver, if that, into what victims of U.S. imperialism may experience abroad. Specifically on the domestic policing, I was riding my bike home on Monday about 11 p.m. post-curfew after the mass arrest in D.C., the tear gas, the flash grenades, and I was driving alone, riding my bike up this hill, and I just see cops zooming all over the place, yelling, slowing down, and then speeding up, flashing their sirens, screaming at people. One cop drove by a group of people just walking home and basically pointed a tear gas gun at them and threatening to yell at them to get home and everything. And my heart just felt racing, and I felt alone, and I just desperately wanted to get in the house. It was the first time I've ever felt that extreme fear as a white person alone at night riding my bicycle. Just kind of that fear that I think just sits with all Black people, most Black people in this country. And on the imperialism front, Dr. Richardson, on Monday, I was also underneath the large DC National Guard helicopter that aggressively dropped on protesters to intimidate them in Chinatown and near the U.S. Capitol building. Well, yesterday, during the day, trying to take a second off, I was in a park near my house, and when a helicopter became audible, I actually caught myself dropping down out of fear, and it kind of triggered that Monday night experience of wanting to seek shelter or safety from that helicopter. And that was just a reflex towards a machine peaceful in the middle of the day. Now imagine that being jets, missiles, bombs, all of that. What an incredible state of affairs. So many are living in this country due to racism, and others living abroad due to U.S. imperialism. Talk about those layers of trauma and what this country is really doing to so many people on this planet.
I think you have to start with the cumulative trauma of the Black experience in this country, and not just from the standpoint of state-sanctioned violence by the police, but structural violence that exists throughout this country. And so I'll use Freddie Gray for an example. So if you think about the death of Freddie Gray, which happened at the hands of state-sanctioned violence with the police, if you look at every single social determinant of health in Freddie Gray's life, and that starts from birth up until he was killed at the age of 24, 25, he had already been a victim of structural violence that was going to lead to an early mortality for residents in his neighborhood of Sandtown, Winchester. And so if you look at the life expectancy of residents in his neighborhood, in his zip code in Baltimore, the life expectancy at that time was 65 years of age, which is approximately the same life expectancy of someone that lives in Haiti, which is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And so the life expectancy in Baltimore is relatively 72 years of age. And so the cumulative aspects of trauma from living in a neighborhood that has poor housing, food deserts, inadequate education, high rates of gun violence, and other social determinants of health, those cumulative factors add up, right? They all add up in the end, ultimately lead to early mortality. And so what you've experienced that night was the experience of Black Americans across this country every day. And you can imagine what that daily experience does physiologically, not only psychologically, but physiologically to your body. And so what I really want your listeners to understand is that there's a physiological effect to the psychological trauma that you experience. And that means that when you're in a state of fight or flight, it produces stress hormones, which are supposed to protect you immediately. But if they stay in that state over a course of time, they ultimately become toxic and begin to wear on your organs. And that process is called weathering, which leads to early mortality. So imagine if you stayed in that state of fight or flight the other night, every single waking hour of your life.
Wow. Yeah.
That's what that experience would feel like. So in regard to the imperialism and the helicopter over top of the protesters last week, what I would say is that people really need to understand that that was one incident. If you think about imperialism and war and the oppressive regimes that the U.S. has imposed upon people of color worldwide, dropping bombs, tanks, the invasion of countries, the ruthless killing of citizens, and whether it's in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Syria, that occurs all across the world. And what we need to recognize as global citizens of the world is not only aligning ourselves with people of color who have been oppressed in the United States, but people of color who have been oppressed worldwide through the imperialism of the United States of America.
Yeah, Dr. Richardson. Yeah, I gotta say, I also just wanted to ask you. I mean, it's interesting watching the media coverage and the conversations kind of shift from the disproportionality of the deaths of those affected by coronavirus, and then it's kind of siloed into this conversation around police brutality, as if these two moments don't always exist with one another, the disproportionate health impacts like you were mentioning, and then police brutality, but then they're on top of each other. How do you think people are doing thus far in being able to intersect those two conversations? And is the media doing a fair job whatsoever bringing those two together, or are we hurting ourselves essentially by kind of separating them and isolating them in our heads?
I think we are doing ourselves a disservice by isolating them and then placing the two narratives in silos. And it's interesting that you bring this conversation up because my research focuses on gun violence and what we know about the intersection of gun violence and COVID. If you look across most large American cities in the United States, where we're seeing high rates of gun violence during the COVID epidemic, we're also seeing high rates of infection in specific zip codes. And that's not by surprise because those zip codes are often victims of structural violence and structural racism. And so I see that the media has pivoted away from, you only need to watch MSNBC to see that every single day within the past 3 months, it was COVID 24 hours a day. We knew how many people were dying each day from COVID, the number of people who were dying that were African Americans when we were able to get that data. And now if you watch the news, there's absolutely nothing about COVID, right? Except for the fact that the protesters may be exposed to potentially being infected. But I think all of these issues kind of intersect around structural racism, institutional racism, and structural violence. And the same social factors that are driving people to protest against police brutality are the same social factors that underlie the disproportionate number of African Americans and Latinos in the U.S., particularly in large cities that are being infected with COVID. And we cannot separate the two because they're both impacted by the same institution.
Dr. Richardson, I greatly appreciate your opinion on this. And I think African-American politics or black politics has been in some way crippled by the Democratic Party in their focus on identity while removing the issue of economics. Because I think what you're getting to is, for all of these people to be out here protesting, that basically what we're talking about is an inequality gap, that the cops are there in order to maintain order because you have so much inequality. You have some areas that you basically deprived of resources and allows those places to basically fester, and then you turn around and throw in cops. And then the question becomes, how do you basically stop those neighborhoods from being poor, which is a policy choice? Do you think that with all of the people who are protesting, that something is somewhat missed if the focus is very narrow and specific to the issue of policing, as opposed to the issue of inequality to get rid of the need for the police in the first place?
Clearly, if you only need to look at the wealth gap between blacks and whites. And so if you look at the net household or a family, which the Brookings Institution just published a report on, net worth of $171,000 compared to $17,000 for a black household. It's 10 times more. So let's just think in terms of the intergenerational wealth gap. Whites have had a 400-year head start on the transference of intergenerational wealth, and most of American families and individuals inherit their wealth by the transfer of the wealth and inheritance. Well, that couldn't happen for African Americans for centuries due to redlining, unemployment opportunities, inability to get bank loans. So all of these structural issues prevented the transference of wealth by generation to African American families. That's not the case for most white families in the United States, right? So you have to look beyond just, okay, the police are attacking Black Americans in the street, but it's also an issue of structural inequality and economic opportunity. And as we are being disproportionately affected by the COVID crisis, and now we have 40 million people that are out of work, it's disproportionately going to affect African Americans economically in the same way it did in the 2008, 2009 recession. And so we can't separate the two regarding economic inequality as well, but African Americans are paying through their taxes for a police force that disproportionately is engaged in state-sanctioned violence against them. So almost a no-win situation without, again, as I mentioned in the outset of my conversation, with kind of true radical change of the structures of America and engaging in a more equitable distribution of wealth. And we just have to come to terms with that racism has prevented us from the equitable distribution of wealth. And we've had movements in the past with the 99% versus the 1%. That was never addressed. Those movements kind of got focused on this inequality gap. Those movements, I thought, were going to bear some fruit on closing that gap, but in many ways that entire movement disappeared. And I would just hope that at this point in time that we don't become so focused on police brutality that we forget about the inequality gaps that are already occurring with African Americans that have been historically part of the institutional racism and policies that have affected the intergenerational transferring of wealth from generation to generation.
Yeah, Dr. Richardson, you're on by any means necessary, a show that comes on after us. We've talked to you on that show before about the challenges to creating the alternatives to policing, because we don't actually know that much about the alternatives. Obviously, we can think about defunding the police, and we know that we need counselors and social workers and housing and food programs, and we can list through all the different programs, but the efficacy and how to do them, the ways in which the programs would best run, we still need to study more. The powers to be of the police state have not given tons of money to study the alternatives to take them down. And so part of this process of dismantling what is creating the new future. But talk to us a little bit more about the challenges that are still out there in thinking through and how we would actually create these alternative societies.
And right now, to be quite honest with you, I would have to say, as a scientist, I don't have clear answers on what the approaches should actually be, but I definitely believe that it starts with a clear understanding of the ways that this inequality has affected the wealth gap among African Americans and how we begin to address that and all the issues that I've mentioned to you before in terms of structural inequality. But I do think that there is a point right now where we can engage in, at least even politically, revisiting issues around even reparations and what would that look like. And so there is on Juneteenth, which will be proposed in Congress to establish a committee to understand the effect that structural racism has had on the economic wealth of African Americans, and commission will then recommend what needs to be done in terms of reparations economically. And we have to have a serious conversation about that, because there are other groups in this country that have been oppressed systematically, that have received reparations. And it's due time to have a very real conversation about that and what ways that this country will choose to own up for its sins. And so one of the ways to begin to address that is a commission. But I don't want to go down this rabbit hole of just generating commission after commission, which we've seen with police reforms, where we assess the problems, we know the answers, but we're afraid to actually have the political will to take a really revolutionary step to addressing it. So in terms of the policing in this country and prison abolition, I don't think there's any reason why we need to continue to incarcerate people for nonviolent offenses. There shouldn't be prisons that exist for people who have engaged in that. And in fact, that's the way that George Floyd died and many other people. They weren't violent people. George Floyd was accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill. And from my understanding, it wasn't even factual. And even if it was, there was no reason to lose your life over that. And so we have to reach out whether we should have prisons, right? There has been a prison abolition movement for decades. And initially, I think people thought that it was a really unrealistic idea. But the more you think about it in terms of who is entrapped in the criminal justice system, many people are just nonviolent offenders. So we should be revisiting abolishing the prison system. But I also think that our approach is a little bit too narrow in thinking about just policing and abolishing the police, right? I think we need to think about the entire justice system. How do we dismantle that system, from prisons to prosecutors, bail reform, all of those things that, and particularly even the word reform, like what does that mean? So I think this is a great place to start to have those conversations about what we want it to look like and rethink it. But we're going to really need to sit down and think hard and long about what we envision will be that new society. But at this point, I think we have enough data to know that what we've been doing for the past few decades hasn't worked.
I love that you said that. We were talking kind of back and forth on this thing of a conversation of reparations. And I've often thought the reparations argument was too politically toxic to make work. And not necessarily that it wasn't right. It's clearly right. It's more so, how do you make the argument in order to make it stick when you have roughly, 70% of the public being white and may just be against that argument. But at this point, I have to be honest. If the argument that is being used right now is that this is somewhat of a criminal justice issue, then by definition, you have to get to, why is it a criminal justice issue? Why do you need the cops to do that? Why are the cops behaving that way? And to some degree, you do really get to this root of, well, look, you have a grossly inequitable society that you need to fix. Do you believe that society is basically chaotic, that requires this level of policing and this level of order? Or do you believe that there's something inherent in the structure of the way that we engage each other, or that the way our society is organized, that it produces a certain level of conflict? And if so, what is that in order for some kind of law or some kind of policy to drive that out? What needs to be done to fix that system?
Again, we need to start with addressing those structural inequalities that lead to the need to have a police force. And even in terms of, for example, studies have shown that over the course of a law enforcement officer's career, that they may only use their gun once or twice over a 25-year career. What would be the point for officers having guns? I mean, empirically, it's proven that the likelihood of an officer using a gun is almost nil compared to the amount of years and days and hours that he spends or she spends on their job. So just from an empirical standpoint, I don't think we're really taking into consideration the data, right? And a lot of these arguments aren't very data-driven. They're very ideologically driven in terms of crime and law enforcement. And what we're seeing right now with Donald Trump is the embracing and taking a page from Nixon of a law and order campaign, which has never worked. We can't police our way out of crime. That's proven to be a false and ineffective approach. And so, again, in the same respect that the government has disregarded the scientists in terms of the COVID crisis, I think they've disregarded what we know about crime, what we know about what produces crime. I've just had an interesting conversation with one of my colleagues who was conducting a fatality review for a large U.S. city. And what he found that in a small number of cases, let's say 60 to 70 cases in fatality reviews that were firearm related, that 90% of the population who were killed in those incidents did not have a high school diploma. So what does that tell you when a significant number of people who are victims of homicide do not have a homicide diploma, a high school diploma? And on any given day in America, if you go into the prisons, particularly with black men, that 70% of black men who may be incarcerated do not have a high school diploma. So we understand what some of the structural factors are to success in education, right? We know how to prevent that. Structural violence is when we have a harm that's preventable, or we can avert someone's death. And if we choose not to engage in those practices to address those structural inequalities, then we've engaged in violence. And again, I think we often need to change. We need to look at the way that we describe violence. Is violence just using a gun?
Well, Dr. Richardson, let me just we just have a few minutes left with you. Let me jump in on that note and ask you a little bit more about this messaging around public health. Public health is clearly something that the United States as a society does not value. I mean, we do not have a public health care option. We're seeing the ravages of coronavirus because we do not often invest in preventative health measures. And now you're basically saying we don't even have the vocabulary in many ways. We don't have the studies in many ways. Even when we do have the science and the data, it's completely ignored by oftentimes liberals who talk about climate change deniers and mock the right for not following data and science. But here we are with data and science around public health and violence that they then ignore. How do we start breaking through and changing some of this messaging to get a better handle on our public health care system within a society that doesn't really value it?
That's $1 million question. Definitely believe, at least from my perspective as a scholar who's been doing this work for a number of years, that the relationships between the scientists and the legislators, we definitely need to have a better relationship in terms of being able to explain to legislators in very layman terms what all of this means. Because I think, there's this notion that, and it's quite political, and we see it in the context right now that scientists have liberal bent ideologies, and to be quite honest, that could potentially be true or not. But the science is undeniable. The stats are undeniable. And so in terms of what we've seen in regard to the COVID crisis and gun violence in this country and just other social determinants of health, I don't think we've done a very good job of kind of connecting our scientists to legislators. And in fact, there was prior to COVID, I was scheduled to be part of a journalist boot camp where I would meet with journalists from around the country, and I would be able to discuss my science in ways that they could translate that narrative to a wider public without engaging in scientific terms that would confuse a population who may not be very familiar with the work, but in a way that was kind of palatable and digestible. And so I think that also needs to happen between scientists and journalists, as we're doing right now, but also needs to happen between scientists and legislators. And far too often, I know personally, the discussions I've had with legislators have been like few and far between. And we need to close the gap on that because, for example, in Maryland, in our recent we had a bill that we sent up to Governor Hogan to support gun violence interventions and preventions. And the bill was for $3 million, which was vetoed. But yet, multi-billion, the law enforcement and criminal justice complexes, a multi-billion-dollar agency, particularly within the state of Maryland and other states of California and New York. And so the fact that we're not able to even get $3 million for violence intervention and prevention, and we know that it works, it's been proven to work, but we have a governor who seems no need to support that kind of legislation, even though, it's a drop in the bucket. Well, there's a total disconnect between the data that scientists are generating and what legislators understand and can translate into policy. And we need to figure out ways to bridge that gap.
Yeah, no, I completely hear you. Muriel Bowser here getting a lot of credit for painting Black Lives Matter on what is now being called Black Lives Matter. Plaza comes out basically a week after she increases her police budget by millions of dollars. The Metropolitan Police Department over $550 million budget, while at the same time cutting $800,000 from violence interruption programs that receive a pittance, a few $1 million at best, on a good year to do the work that we know will save lives. Well, with that, we are out of time with Dr. Joseph Richardson, a professor of African American Studies and Medical Anthropology at the University of Maryland College Park and the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Dr. Richardson, where can people find more of you and your work online?
You can visit the African American Studies website. You can find my webpage there. You can also find me on Twitter at DocJorich Rich on Twitter, and the same on Instagram. And I'm also producing a digital storytelling project, which will focus on gun violence actually in D.C. among 10 young Black male survivors of gun violence and the intersection of their lives with the criminal justice system. And we'll be explicitly diving into the social determinants of health around gun violence, which is a narrative that is much needed to frame gun violence as a disease, and particularly as a biopsychosocial disease.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Joseph Richardson. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed soundbites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear, 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehever here, sort of kind of with Jamarl Thomas. We continue our show now with news over the weekend that was shockingly unshocking, but has tremendous implications for the current political unrest in Bolivia. A new study by independent researchers using data obtained by the New York Times from the Bolivian electoral authorities has found that the Organization of American States, who were tapped with observing Bolivia's October 2019 elections, were wrong in their statistical analysis of the results. As you remember, the OAS at the time cited an inexplicable change that, quote, drastically modifies the fate of the election, heightened doubts about the fairness of the vote, and fueled a chain of events that changed the South American nation's history. The opposition seized on the claim to escalate protests, gather international support, and push Mr. Morales from power with military support weeks later. And it turns out the numbers were cooked. Here to talk more about this is Gustavo Vargas, a member of the Bolivian immigrant community in the D.C. area and a member of DMV Bolivia Solidarity Network. Gustavo, thanks for being with us.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to talk a little bit.
Yeah, Gustavo, quite remarkable here in the New York Times, citing that the conclusion that Mr. Morales' share of the vote jumped inexplicably in the final ballots relied on incorrect data and inappropriate statistical techniques. Francisco Rodriguez, an economist who teaches at Latin American Studies at Tulane University, said in regards to the findings, quote, "We took a hard look at the OAS statistical evidence and found problems with their methods. Once we correct those problems, the OAS results go away, leaving no statistical evidence of fraud." Obviously, Gustavo, the OAS is now arguing that the numbers aside, there was still fraud and voter suppression, but this here continues to discredit the U.S. and the OAS as neutral election monitors.
Yes, that's correct. And that is one big problem that we've had in Latin America, particularly in the past 15 years, as we see the OAS having too much agency in positioning governments all across Latin America. And this is not, the Bolivian case is not an exception. And in fact, it's probably one of the most evident ones where Almagro, the secretary director of the OAS, is pretty much blatantly lying and openly supporting a regime change in Bolivia. And so this article that came yesterday is another article. Was another article like a few months ago, or maybe a month and a half ago, that the Washington Post published about MIT researchers proving the same flaws in the OAS report. And then very soon after the elections, there's an independent study, the CEPR from Washington, D.C., the Center for Economic and Political Research. They came out with a report as well back in, I believe it's November, and the media ignored this report. In fact, I'd say that mainstream media probably almost intentionally pretty much looked down on this report, even though a lot of the work that this report was stating was based on statistics and data collection that independent researchers from this organization did. So this information about how the OAS report on Bolivian elections is flawed has been out and about since November. In the media, mainstream media, U.S. mainstream media is only catching up to this. And that is something that we need to pay attention to, because it seems to be it is part of an orchestrated blockade.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit more, Gustavo. I mean, this does show the incredible power of the media, specifically the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and others to sway national opinion. I mean, I talked to a lot of folks after the election back in October of 2019 there, and they pointed to the OAS report as fact, and that it clearly showed to them that Morales was behind some sort of voter fraud scheme and that he was a horrible dictator. And here we are, the damage is done. This obviously is not going to retract that story from 2019. So the damage is done. There's no putting Morales back in office. The OAS is obviously not going to shuttle him back in and be like, you know what, we got the numbers wrong. He isn't a dictator, actually freedom loving, democratic leader, fairly elected. We're beyond that right now. And these media outlets have that huge ability and huge power to do tremendous damage, and no one holds them to account. Here we are 9 months later.
Yeah, so it basically, once the coup d'etat against Evo Morales happened in November last year, there was a complete media blockade. And this media blockade was orchestrated by the coup mongers in Bolivia and supported by the U.S. Because they started expelling media outlets like Telesur, for instance, immediately as soon as they got into power or took power. And this was reflected in international media. Soon after, but the media blockade and orchestration of the coup is not new. It also started as soon as Evo Morales got elected in 2005. Back then, a lot of media, mainstream media in Bolivia, split. And there was a faction that was constantly trying to, with lies, of course, disseminate misinformation about the Evo Morales government. And I'm not trying to say the Evo Morales government was by no means free of faults. Of course, they made many mistakes and whatsoever, but those same outlets that had pronounced themselves against the government in 2005 played a big role in 2019 in consolidating the media blockade. And they were worked in conjunction with the interior government of Bolivia to pretty much oppress and suppress any dissent in Bolivia.
Gustavo, there was, welcome to the show, by the way. There were reports of the opposition party in Bolivia requesting the OAS to do exactly what the OAS did. Can you talk about the links between the OAS in the United States and the perspective that the OAS takes that seems to be in line with the United States, and why it takes the perspective that seems to be in line with the United States?
The United States, yes. So in leading up to the coup, Almagro pretty much was first. The OAS was the first organization that tweeted without any evidence that there might be a fraudulent election happening in Bolivia. So that alone, organization like the OAS tweeting without any evidence something so severe is irresponsible. But that shows us that that is something that the U.S. does, and it polices the world, right? The U.S. is really good at planting evidence or criminalizing their potential revolutionary thoughts, right? So the U.S. line uses the OAS to monitor Latin American governments and to see and to try to neutralize any dissent that comes from against the U.S. government. So Evo Morales' policies were anti-imperialist in nature. So of course the U.S. went after Morales in the beginning, and it didn't matter who was in power in the U.S. Obama did it, everybody did it, and used the OAS to have agency in all these proceedings that the U.S. wants to change regimes and whatever.
Yeah, Gustavo, I'm curious your perspective. You're in the United States. We're watching these massive protests unfold. We're watching people take to the streets to demand change from the government, and then we're seeing the government and the repressive forces come out, and then we're starting to see some fractioning between different aspects of the government, different elected officials, and then we see obviously military voice and police voices get really strong and really angry at this moment. And we saw the same thing happen in Bolivia. You see a spiraling in the political situation. We see media coming and attacking Morales, and then you see the military step in and basically take over the country until it was handed off to kind of a caretaker government. I'm curious what you are thinking in this moment, the parallels between what you had seen there in Bolivia over the last 9 months and what's taking place here in the United States.
Yeah, the parallels are huge. And that is to say that we can start by saying that many of us do not believe in the American brand of democracy that's been imposed upon other countries in the world. So we can begin with that. We know that the U.S. imperialism is exporting this brand of democracy that includes militarization and over-policing and racism. So that, starting from that fact, with the parallels obviously are the same because in Bolivia, the recent racist coup d'etat against Evo Morales has the exact same characterizations. So we know that colonialism left Latin American states that are systematically racist against the indigenous population mostly, but also against the African population that was brought out to the Americas. So we can start from that common ground. So what happens in the U.S. happens in Latin America. Latin America countries are racist, systematically racist, and the population is also, especially the white middle class, is racist. And coincidentally, the coup d'etat in Bolivia happened because the white middle class supported the coup d'etat. So that is not a coincidence. That is just a change in rhetoric that the oppositors to Evo Morales orchestrated over the years, and they figured out that if they frame Mas as a criminal or socialist or communist organization, then they can claim they are no longer a democratic organization, and that's how they started. Also, it's worth mentioning that racism in Bolivia particularly has so many faces, and there's this double standard that happens, right? So a lot of the same middle class that you see supporting the coup d'etat against Evo Morales and against indigenous people are the same middle class that are now pretending to support the movements in the U.S. without even realizing that what they just did a few months ago was an act of racism. So that would be a first parallel. And then the reaction of the militarization that the interim government of self-proclaimed of Añez executed this huge militarization across.
Yeah, Gustavo, let me cut you off there. We are out of time here, but that over heavy arm of the military, it's no game, people. These things escalate quickly, and the military only knows how to escalate. There is no de-escalation that takes place. With that, we do need to take a quick break. Big thank you to Gustavo Vargas, a member of the Bolivian immigrant community in the D.C. area and a member of the DMV Bolivia Solidarity Network. A quick break, and then we're back with another hour of Political Misfits live in D.C. We're back after this.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my disembodied co-host, Bob Schlehuber, not here but ever present. We still have lots to cover over the hour, including our Mr. Press segment. As always, we appreciate your chats, your tweets, your calls. You can reach us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. So the other day, a bit of news fluttered across the mainstream media airwaves with the former Secretary of Defense, Colin Powell, the most honest man in the Bush administration, said he would not be voting for one Donald Trump. Let's hear Colin Powell give the reason why.
We are at turning points. I mean, the Republican Party, the president, thought they were sort of immune. They can go say anything they wanted. And even more troubling, the Congress would just sit there and not in any way resist what the president's doing. And the one word I have to use with respect to what he's been doing for the last several years is a word I would never have used before. I never would have used with any of the four presidents I've worked for. He lies. He lies about things. And he gets away with it because people will not hold him accountable. And so while we're watching him, we need to watch our Congress. I watched the senators heading into the chamber the other day after all this broke, with a reporter saying, "What do you have to say? What do you have to say?" They had nothing to say. They would not react. And so we're not a country of just a president. We have a Congress. We have a Supreme Court. But most of all, we have the people of the United States, the ones who vote him in and the ones who vote him out.
He is a living irony. I'm floored by that. I am utterly floored by that response. He is basically saying he lies. I wouldn't say this with any of the other presidents that I worked for, not even George Bush. Lied us into a war. On top of this, we have Joe Biden, who is basically trying to ingratiate himself to the Floyd family to suck up the energy of the protests. To get wise and appreciated analysis, we are joined by a friend of the show, Margaret Kimberly, editor and senior columnist at Black Agenda Report and author of the book, Prejudicial, Black America and the Presidents. Margaret, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing okay. I have recovered from seeing Nancy Pelosi and Kent Clark, but I'm doing all right.
We've been laughing about that in the background. Our producer has been putting up the videos where we're pointing out to, and I saw it on Twitter. Yeah, that's pretty disturbing, right? These guys are basically trying to, this kind of tokenism stuff, you know, they're just putting on a show with no real energy, spirit, or reality behind it. I'm curious, as you've been watching this protest, I've been having this little thing burning in me as I've been watching this protest, and I've realized that little thing budding in me that is unfamiliar, that I don't necessarily know what it is, that's been beaten, burned, and yet still there, is hope. That little thing is hope. So how have you been processing all of these people around the United States and all of these people around the world throwing their bodies into the streets?
I do have hope. We have to be, a revolutionary has to be optimistic. I think Che Guevara said that, or people say he said it. I think it's definitely true. I have been surprised by the fact that these protests are sustained. I have been surprised that they have been so racially diverse. But I think the murder of George Floyd was the last straw. People are living under great stress. First of all, it was the second hate crime murder that we saw in video. Ahmaud Arbery, we saw his death about a month or so before George Floyd. So I think every incident builds power of it, and the outrage builds. We also have economy in a state of, I will call it collapse, or the beginning of collapse. A COVID-19 pandemic made worse by incompetence at the top, the disproportionate impact of COVID on black people. There are some cities in this country where the only people who died of COVID were black. People, newly unemployed people, and in many states couldn't even access their benefits. So I think all of this led, and by the way, to some degree or other, all of this is going on all over the world. And I think, too, this is a after effect of Bernie Sanders' withdrawal and capitulation. Supporters were all dressed up with no place to go. And I think they are among the white people involved. I believe they are most of those see. So I think all of this has led to this huge rebellion involving many people, and it's not going to end anytime soon, and that's a wonderful thing.
That is a wonderful thing indeed. So do you believe Joe Biden is the answer? I mean, Joe Biden is out there taking a knee. He has all those black folks behind him, and he's lying to each one, saying he was part of the civil rights movement. But he's is Joe Biden the answer to fix this problem?
It's not. He's first of all, this was a Democratic Party problem too. Police didn't start killing people in January 2017 when he was Obama's vice president. The degree of police violence was made known to us all. The Obama administration, I believe, they prosecuted one cop as they were about to go out the door. Eric Garner's killers walking around free. All of the people whose names we now know. And the federal government has the ability, absolute ability, to file charges when the local governments fail. So no, he's not the answer. He's the most right-wing Democrat they could possibly have found. He has his own troubling history of making racist statements, of enacting racist legislation. He brags about the crime bill, which sent so many thousands of people to jail. So he's not the answer, and electoral politics is not the answer. Excuse me, I'm not telling anyone not to vote, but voting does not end police violence. If so, we wouldn't have it. So, and plus, I think he's likely to lose. I think everybody who voted for Trump in 2016 will vote for him again. And Biden has no personal appeal, no initiative tied to his name, no excitement, nothing. And so I believe Trump can win again in the electoral college and perhaps even in the popular vote. I think that's how bad Biden is.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I feel like this. I would have said that 3 months ago, and I've been saying that 3 months ago, and now I don't know if I could say that. I mean, to see these new polls out, the lead growing, doesn't seem like Trump has anywhere to go in the economy. I know Joe Biden's awful, and I completely hear you, and they're hoping and praying that it's a referendum on Donald Trump. So a lot of time to go between June and November, but yeah, it's fascinating how it plays out that all of this could happen and Donald Trump could find himself back in the White House come in January. Margaret, Kimberly, I did want to ask you a little bit about the intersection between race and municipal budgets. We've been talking a lot about the defunding of police, what that language means. I talked a little bit about this with April Goggins, who's one of the lead organizers with Black Lives Matter DC, about this intersection between race as well as the economy. I had the chance to talk to her as they actually added to Muriel Bowser's mural here in Washington, D.C., where it said Black Lives Matter, and they added next to it, defund the police. Here's my conversation with April late Saturday evening.
So, I mean, it's true that, you know, our council may be still majority of black our mayor may be black, but the fact of the matter is that black people are not benefiting from that at all. So, we are targeting the budget. Muriel Bowser is definitely trying to add a lot more money to the police budget while defunding money for violence interruption, violence prevention. And these are things that, disparately impact black people. So to us, it's proof that black lives don't matter to Muriel Bowser. They don't matter in D.C.
Muriel Bowser, Democrat, the Washington, D.C. City Council, all Democrats. Margaret Kimberly, weigh in here on the Democrats. Tell us a little bit more about the Democrats and now this growing call to defund the police.
Well, we have to be very careful. It sounds like a good idea. I think it is a very positive thing that people are questioning the very existence of police departments and their value. We had a couple years ago here in New York, Mayor de Blasio got in a spat with the police union, and they all called out sick for a couple of days, and we were fine. So I thought it was ironic. They made my case that we don't need them. But we do have to be careful. There's so much sleight of hand with budgets. So, and also you can have private police forces. I think this is productive. It sounds like a good idea, but we need to be talking about two things. We need to be talking about real community control of the police, the power to hire, to fire, to subpoena, and not these BS civilian complaint review boards, which are pretty much useless, but have agencies with this power to really control what the police do, and ultimately to talk about prison abolition and police abolition. Of course, the police they're the ones who feed into the mass incarceration system. So we need a much bigger discussion, and we have to think before we support these things which may seem very good. We should be making the most radical proposals possible at this juncture.
Yeah, that's what's kind of interesting about it. You talk about if we got rid of the public police, if that's the phrase, developers and other people with wealth would just basically hire private contractors, mercenaries, whatever you want to call them. And so it is that kind of like, where do we go from here now? And I do think it is important, though, to put that language out there to kind of say, well, then what? It's great you said Black Lives Matter, but what does that mean to it? And keep on pushing it. A lot of people, a lot of white people have really kind of spooked themselves with this idea of defunding the police. Oh my God, what would it mean? Even though when you talk to them and explain it to them, and even if you have leaders within their own community saying, actually, policing is highly ineffective, even if you put a police officer in front of them and say this isn't an effective way to address these issues and make you safe in your own communities, people will still kind of go, yeah, but we still need the police. So Margaret Kimberly, so much of it seems like just the unconditioning of Americans as well as white Americans to think of the police differently. And that's a huge conversation, though, when it comes to behavioral change, communication and messaging across this country.
Yeah, but I think we also have to acknowledge that people say not all cops or we still need them. There are many people, especially many white people, who want to have police to control the black population. So there's going to be, some people are overt in that belief. For some it's a less conscious belief. But having a police force that acts as a modern-day slave patrol is just fine for millions of people. And that is why we have to give a lot of thought before we get behind these proposals.
Margaret, I'm curious. I like when you make the point of you need to be bold in your proposals. After all, we have the Minneapolis police force, 9 people on city council basically saying they're going to disband that police force. You have the mayor crying and going out to the public, basically pleading to a certain degree for forgiveness and basically asking, what can you do to make change? But you have all of these people around the world marching, and it feels insignificant in comparison to the number of people you have marching, the amount of energy that these people are expending. I agree. It needs to be something big and expansive, and a demand needs to be made by this crowd. What should that demand be? I think that's one of the most interesting questions to me. Because if you make that demand and you have all of these people with like 80% of the American public saying, yes, we agree with the protests. Okay, what is the demand of the protests? If it was you, what would that demand be?
Well, I believe we need a more expansive demand. We cannot, yes, we are at this moment because of the death of one person, but we have to look at the bigger picture and all the systemic problems that brought it about. One of the groups I'm affiliated with, Black Alliance for Peace, has a campaign, No Compromise, No Retreat. And it includes demands to investigate, the federal government to investigate every police killing. In the 1033 program to the surplus military equipment, which ends up in the hands of podunk police departments all over the country. A candidate pledge, making sure that candidates at all levels of government promise to do these things, to defund AFRICOM, to close military bases. All of this is linked. We can't get justice in this country when there is 60% of our budget federal budget going to the military. It means the people can't get what they need. You're not going to have justice at home and injustice abroad. People like to think that if I can get what I want domestically, I don't have to worry about the U.S. starting wars around the world. Well, it's the same. A country that disregards human rights everywhere else on the planet will disregard them here. That's why Black Alliance for Peace and other groups are asking for the United Nations to investigate human rights abuses in the U.S. So we must look at the very big picture. We must connect all of the dots, connect the fact that Black people are dying of COVID in disproportionate numbers. So all of these things have to be on the table. We've got to be people who look nationally and internationally and link them all together. And that means we need organizations. I'm surprised these protests have been sustained. They've been spontaneous and carried out by concerned individuals, and that's wonderful. But we need grassroots organizing too, and then we can direct our energies in the most effective.
I agree with you, but shouldn't it be specific? Like, to make the demand of saying, these people are out there, they're inspired by Floyd. I strongly suspect they're supplanting other anger and, a certain degree of, they get this is wrong. And they have those things in their various societies themselves that they get this is wrong. And like you said, those people for Sanders, I think I said last week, the return of Sanders. You guys, they asked that question, where are the Bernie people? Those people are out there protesting because they realize what they wanted, they're not going to get politically. Should that demand be very specific, though? I mean, should that demand be, say, we want Medicare for all, we want, and make that and tie that to this notion of inequality that is somewhat plaguing and somewhat ensconced in our society? Meaning, should the demand be specific to inequality, where you could say these are the specific things that we want, where your political system has to either accept or not, as opposed to a notion of we want to get rid of AFRICOM and so forth? The American public has no idea what that is. Does that make sense? Like, even though it's like, yes, you're right, by the same token, if the public doesn't know what that is, how can the demand ever necessarily be acknowledged? Doesn't the demand have to meet people on some level where they are for it to even be accepted?
That's true, but that part has to be. That's why we need better organizing and so that these things that people aren't as aware of, they can become aware of. And it can happen again. It happened, I was a kid, but I remember the teach-ins around the Vietnam War. And ordinary people made themselves aware of what was going on the other side of the world. But to answer your question about a demand that everyone would understand right now, the federal government has to prosecute cops. It can't be a local responsibility any longer. Any use of lethal force must be investigated and prosecuted by the Justice Department. There has to be a special civil rights division, but I think it's something that has to be elevated in stature and elevated in power. Because these cops, the cop who had his knee on George Floyd's neck had every reason to believe that he would get away with it. He had no reason to believe he would ever be arrested or pay a price, or the others who looked on and went along with the wall of silence. They had no reason to believe that anything would come of it. And I think a first concrete step with this issue of police violence is to put them all on notice. You're all going to be investigated. You're all going to be prosecuted. This is how it will work. It doesn't matter what people think in your town or city, or if the politicians are afraid of the police unions, or if the prosecutors are in bed with the police, which they always are. So I think that's something we can start out with concretely. And I think it's more important to say that than to talk about defunding.
Well, Mark, Kimberly, let me just ask you one question here before we go to caller with DJ, because I have a lot of my organizing friends listening to the show who are exhausted right now after 2 weeks of just mass organizing and being down there at the protests, organizing marches, following up with people, keeping people safe. Obviously, painting the defund the police was a huge task, and all of these people have been doing political education communities the last several years. So I do organizing, but maybe give me a little bit better understanding of what you mean by they aren't organized, because obviously there's tons of different organizing groups that have been doing education, not to the level, I guess, to hear my self-talk, that we talked a lot about the lack of political education that Bernie Sanders needed amongst his base to turn people out, because people do need to understand what they're voting for if they're going to turn out for a revolution, something dramatically different than what is currently. Those people need to turn out. So I guess I'm hearing myself on both ends. So maybe tell me a little bit more. What is this kind of deeper organizing that you're speaking about that's kind of beyond what we have right now?
It has to be something that's ongoing. There are people active now in this moment, but will they be active 6 months from now or a year from now? And I think that can happen, but there has to be a recognition that we need that to happen, so that when we hear that Minneapolis has some plan to disband police, and I need to hear more about that to see what it means, that people don't relax and just say, we've won. I believe in as was just said, I believe in tying it all together, tie all of it together. And I also think that people need to separate demands from electoral political activity. One of the things I hope that comes from this is that progressives finally leave the Democratic Party. And that can, happen in a number of ways. There's the Greens, I'm a Green. There's Movement for a People's Party. There are all sorts of things being discussed. I think it's all good. But I think we have to know that we must have, in general, but especially about issues like this, must have a more adversarial relationship with these people who are in office. Or else they think they can wear kente cloth and take a knee and all's good with the world. They do not want these protests. They are terrified of the idea of people leaving their parties, of people of various races coming together, because if you march about the police, you might march for a general strike, you might march against war, you could march to put them out of office, you could come together in solidarity for so many things that they do not want to talk about.
Yes, absolutely. Their power is in the political space, and as long as your energy is channeled into that space, you are to some degree controlled. When those people move out of that space, they get terrified. I mean, and to make your point, 99% of cops from 2013 and 2019, 99% of cops that were involved in a cop killing got off. No charges were even filed. Meaning all of those cops that were perfectly justified in thinking that whatever we do, I can dispense maximum justice in that one moment, hair moment. Tamir Rice, whether it's Eric Garner, and it's the most tiniest of insignificant thing that flips these guys off, where they dispense maximum justice and kills the person. I think, honestly, that Democratic Party and blacks in the Democratic Party has broken African Americans regarding politics. You guys talk about the black misleadership class. How did that happen? I mean, because Martin Luther King, these guys were very specific in regards to this understanding of race and class, and how this legacy of slavery in this country has created, even coming up to redlining and Jim Crow and all of this other stuff that was instantiated by cops. How did the black community get detached from the economic angle of politics?
Sure. Well, first it was deliberate. Leaders such as King were assassinated. There was a reaction against it. Richard Nixon's Law and Order campaign, which was at the time a code word for putting black people back in their place. They revved up the prison system. I once read there were only 600,000 people in the entire country incarcerated when King was still alive, and now there are more than 2 million. So you dissipate a movement by literally putting people away. They also co-opted people. There were people who protested. They let them into the system. Well, we'll let you be a congressman. Well, we'll give you a job in corporate America. So they dissipated the anger, and the political system has been moving further and further to the right over the decades. So now we're left with black politics, which amounts to little more than trying to keep Republicans out of office and nothing more. And that's how you end up with the train wreck like Joe Biden being the Democratic Party nominee.
They continue to get worse. We have a caller on the line. DJ, what's going on, DJ?
Hey, how's it going, Jamar? Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
The fact that we don't address the clause literally baffles me. You incentivize finding slave labor for the prison system. The criminal justice system, it's built entirely around this clause. And I mean entirely around it. That's where the capitalism component comes in. It's not like a real head scratcher. I hope that we kind of start talking about that soon. Because if you remove the profit component from seeking and arresting people, then the disproportionate engagement, it stops dramatically or it'll totally decrease. It'll decrease, right? If these companies had to actually pay prisoners like regular employees, they would stop investing in these slave institutions that's disguised as centers for reform. NASA, Walmart, Costco, Nintendo, Whole Foods, McDonald's, AT&T, Victoria's Secret, British Petroleum, Starbucks, Microsoft, American Airlines. These are just a few of the companies that invest in private prisons, and they can push back on employees as well. When they say, oh, well, we don't want to pay you this. We have the largest population for prisons in the world because companies make money off of this. It's as simple as saying neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime whereof they shall be duly convicted. If you just put no exceptions, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States of any place subject to their jurisdictions, no exceptions. You change that clause, you remove the incentive to make money from people, from human beings. That's all. I love your show, and that's it.
Thank you, DJ. I appreciate the call.
DJ.
Margaret, would you like to respond? Basically, we incentivize putting human beings in cages through policy, and that if we remove that particular amendment, I think it's the 13th Amendment, that we would basically eliminate the need or the drive to put people in cages. I don't know if I entirely believe that we would eliminate the drive to put people in cages. So I don't think that would take out the capitalistic incentive. But Margaret, would you like to respond?
Yes, he makes an excellent point. I think one thing we should do is require any product made by prisoners to say "made in prison." I think that's a simple demand. People need to understand the depth of the situation. If you're in a call center and the person you're talking to is incarcerated, there should be a message saying you're talking to an incarcerated person. I think people need to be made aware of the depth of this problem. But yes, it is something that needs to be repealed. Repealing a constitutional amendment is a heavy lift, though. Both houses of Congress, the president signing 2/3 of the states. I'm not saying it can't be done. I don't know when the last constitutional amendment took place. It's been a while, though, and that's a reason why. But so, yes, he is right. And I think it's something that people can demand at the local level. First of all, I think one popular demand has to be to cut the number of incarcerated people in half. Most people in prison they haven't been convicted of violent offenses. It's mostly non-violent offenders. So most people in prison could easily, I would say half, can easily be released. So this has to be at the top of priorities of popular demand. And it's one of the things that is tied to police violence. These police encounters lead into filling the prison system. So, yes, I do agree with him. I don't know if getting rid of that would be a panacea. I still think there's a systemic urge and a need many people have to keep Black people under physical control, but it is something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it's interesting without that clause there, what the rebellion would be by those who think it should be there. And Margaret, I guess I'm kind of curious. Now the bar is set pretty high for social protest and unrest. The damage and destruction that people were crying about on Saturday has led to a national conversation, even at the AFL-CIO building, which was set on fire on Sunday, just the lobby and some glass broken. They've now covered all of the boards up there at the AFL-CIO building with Black Lives Matter signs, and we're seeing a change. And so now it is clear that there, for me, is seemingly a role for property destruction, not the destruction of lives. Now, come on now, let's talk about what's happening by the military and the police. They're destroying people's lives, and people are upset by protesters destroying property. But seemingly when you destroy property now, it shows that that is actually a catalyst for change, that perfect storm that you had mentioned with all of these different killings taking place that were caught on camera that led into this moment, Margaret. But I'm just kind of curious how you think this is going to set the tone for future protests if these demands aren't met.
Well, I'm convinced the burning of the police precinct in Minneapolis led to the cop being arrested. The first cop, the one who put his knee on George Floyd's neck, I'm sure they would have tried to find a way to keep from arresting him if the precinct hadn't burned. The protesters upped the ante. And when people talk about violence, to me, that means violence against a person. I don't consider property destruction to be violent. And frankly, it's not of any concern. It's not a greatest concern to me. And people do respond, and we can't say it doesn't count, it doesn't help. Well, I think it did. I think it pushed things forward. And we should have, and if people are so outraged about that, they should be pushing for a system that doesn't need to have people burn down police buildings in order to have an expectation of justice. So those for whom this is a big issue, they've got work to do, and we need to put them on the spot and tell them that they have a role to play rather than whining, frankly, about a police building that didn't do anybody any good and destruction of police property. That's frankly what we need.
You missed something.
Need more of.
You said something that is utterly fascinating to me, because I think both of us agree that a lot of this have to do with issues of inequality, especially when you get into wealth disparities, the communities where they make the argument for policing. Basically, we need to pay half poor to police the other half of the poor. But you made the point that says you want, or you believe that there's a certain segment of the society that wants to keep black bodies basically in cages or under fists or underhand. Do you believe that's more prevalent than the economic issue? Meaning, if you're looking at your society and you're looking at both and you're saying which way is the wind blowing, or which one has the greatest bearing in regards to getting somewhere, in regards to getting something changed, is it that prevalent where you believe that the other part, meaning the economic part, is almost fundamentally impossible or difficult to do just because there's a segment of the population that is just against any level of emancipation, of evening out how these races are being interacting in this country?
Well, I think that changes when people are more insecure. People who are comfortable are likely to go along with the status quo, to be in denial, or to even support it. But now you have a lot of uncomfortable people who are angry about the change has all been for the worse. When they talk about jobs growth, it's always low wage work. This was even before the wave of unemployment created by the COVID-19 quarantines. Young people especially, they have no expectation of the things I had an expectation of, that you would get out of college with maybe a little bit of debt and absolutely walk into a job with benefits, a living wage job. People who were working class thought that would continue forever. They and their kids would always have well-paid work, whether blue-collar or white-collar. So I think the more discomfort you have, the more likely people are to look outside of whatever box they put themselves in. So I believe that this general discomfort and discontent about the way people's the conditions that people are living under can move that needle. And people who a few years ago might have said, that doesn't have anything to do with me, or I support it, are now able to see, are likely to become involved in a different way.
Yeah, fascinating times. With that, we are out of time, unfortunately, with Margaret Kimberly, editor and senior columnist at Black Agenda Report and author of the book Presidential, Black America and the Presidents. Margaret, where can people find more of you and your book online?
You can read my work at blackagendareport.com. I'm on Twitter, Freedom Ride blog. My book, Presidential, Black America and the Presidents, can be ordered at Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, or the steerforthpress.com website.
Fantastic. Tomorrow, we do need to take a quick break before coming back with our weekly Miss the Press segment, one of my favorites. You listen to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik. I'm Bob Schlaber here with Jamarl Thomas. It's time for our weekly Miss the Press segment where we take a look at the worst interviews, the worst questions, the worst guests from America's Sunday morning talk shows. Jamarl, I have to start with our good old boy buddy here, Ben Carson, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, or as I like to refer to him as the Final Four in Donald Trump's Celebrity Apprentice Cabinet Edition. If I have my math right here, the only remaining four from Trump's original cabinet is Carson, Betsy DeVos, Elaine Chao, and Wilbur Ross.
Wow,
Jamal, I think
Ross still made it. Ross still there.
He's still alive.
Carson is always sleepy enough to make it through, but Ross, that's commendable.
I have my money on Elaine Chao, but she could be on the out if Mitch McConnell's out here, and then Ben Carson. I feel like one of those two are my front runners. Who do you have? You have DeVos ahead, or do you think Ross is hanging on for the win?
I think Ross is going to hang on. At this point, I think they're hanging on. I mean, these guys are these people are fantastically rich, and they've been able to enrich themselves further. I mean, look at DeVos's main thing was, I gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Republican Party, so I'm putting in the spot. No claim to fame for DeVos.
Yeah, I mean, I think Wilbur Ross has an IV connected to the money that they're stealing from the feds right now, so you might be set for a while. But anyways, back to Ben Carson on State of the Union this week with Jake Tapper. In the interview, Tapper asked Carson, now that the NFL and others have come out and said that they were wrong about being against kneeling during the U.S. national anthem, he asked whether or not Carson himself would now support the First Amendment action of kneeling. Here is Carson's response.
Do you support NFL players exercising that right to peacefully protest by kneeling during the anthem?
Have you ever seen two people in a vehement argument and they're talking about completely different things and they're talking past each other and they're not able to come to a solution? That's what this is all about. There are some people who are talking about the flag. We're talking about our veterans. We're talking about people who sacrificed their lives. We're talking about our police officers. And there are others who are talking about injustice in the system, and they're arguing past each other. That's the problem.
Jamal, I'm curious what you made of this. For me, he's trying to separate these conversations out as if policing, the flag, the military, conversations of injustice and police brutality, as if they're all these different conversations if they're not kind of the same thing. Shout out to Michelle Whitty for basically saying here, it's like somebody saying that sneezing and coughing are dramatically different things as if they're not both symptoms of a cold. And so he's basically for me, I was laughing because it sounded like he was just talking past Jake Tapper as he was talking about talking by people, which is pretty ironic. So I'm curious, Jamal, what you made of that. I'm also curious, Jamal, as Kente Cloth wearing Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer take knees today, I was taking bets with friends over the weekend on whether or not Drew Brees, the NFL quarterback who found himself in hot water last week in the New Orleans Saints for basically saying he was against Black Lives Matter and the kneeling, and then he later then apologized, and now he's a leader for the black community. Taking bets on whether or not Drew Brees and the entire NFL, more than Adrian Peterson, the famous running back in the league who plays for the Washington Football Club, the racist named football club, let's mind you now, has said absolutely him and other teammates will be mean. I just imagine they all were. So, Jamal, what did you make of Carson's comments, and how much money do you want to bet with me that Brees will or won't take a knee on opening day if there is one?
It's so weird. I mean, like, you know, he's talking about this as if the people who are conflating it not intent. Like, let me say it this way. When Kaepernick took that knee, he took that knee to make this point that you're killing us. And me throwing a pigskin matters less than what is taking place in real world terms by real human beings being killed by cops. And being there, no accountability. Again, 2013, 2019, no accountability. The people who basically say you're desecrating the flag are conflating and missing the point. Now, for him to say these two people are talking past each other, oh, yeah, you could say that, but you're also kind of missing the point that the guy who was kneeling was very specific in the point that he said he was kneeling for. And if you're going to say you're defacing the flag on that, then you're basically saying that the flag, something that's not real, matters that much more than these people's lives. And you're intentionally inflating it because he's very clear on what he's talking about. Now, for Ben Carson to be asked a very specific question of, do you agree with X or Y, misses the point entirely. Do you agree with this, yes or no? Nobody asks you for an analysis of the arguments or the debates that people are having. They asked you very specifically, do you agree with this? Carson is just uncomfortable to say yes. And so he doesn't say yes. He's a Republican. This is a class argument for him. And I guess he's in a quagmire here, where he's like, oh, my Republican Party doesn't want me to say yes to this, but he's in a quagmire. He's in a quagmire.
Maybe that's why. And he somehow just sleepishly answers his question. And that's why he's a strong frontrunner to remain in the cabinet to win Celebrity Apprentice, the cabinet position there. And I mean, my God, Ben Carson just carrying the water for the Republicans there is like their token black guy, happy to say whatever they need. And this goes again, the intersection between race and class, as you're mentioning there. Once you kind of reach a certain stratosphere, then your blackness for you maybe go away, obviously, when white people, well, much poorer than you, with no degrees, no background, no job, will look down and spit on you, Jamal Thomas. And so, again, you always are reminded of your race in that same token. Let's get here to our next clip. And, you know, I don't want to waste time to get over to the nonsense of Meet the Press. Chuck Todd letting your boy, Jamal Thomas, Senator Cory Booker, talk all sorts of nonsense this week on the show. Jamal, I want to play part of Booker's response when Todd asked him what he thought about this national call to defund the police. And again, I'm going to simply remind listeners here that defund the police means giving less money to police, just like we give less money to education, less money to health, less money to shelter and food. We defunded all of those programs. So hell, even if you want to compromise that we continue to defund all the vital services we need to live, let's also then defund the police. At least defunding the police will keep some folks alive. Anyways, Jamal, I want to play the end of Booker's answer here first, and then come back to the beginning to make my point. Let's start with the end of what Booker says in response to whether or not the police are costly or they're effective, and whether or not he would support defunding the police. Here's the end.
Is that we are over-policed as a society, that we are investing in police, which is not solving problems, but making them worse.
Okay, so we're over-policed and we're over-invested. Seems like the solution to that, Jamal, would be defunding the police. So let's now listen to the beginning of this same interview when Chuck Todd asked Booker, should we defund the police? Here's Booker's response to that.
Well, I understand clearly the sentiment and the substance behind the slogan. And so while it's not a slogan I'll use, if people just dismiss it and don't get deeper into the substance.
So, Jamal, this is what feckless leadership looks like to me. This is what it looks like to be the Democratic Party in 2015, sending memos to the rank and file, say, do not commit to supporting Black Lives Matter. Do not say it. It's cowardice. And if you think it is political suicide or you feel retaliation by the police and you're scared for that, then that's fine. But then stop talking, Cory Booker, about how much you appreciate Dr. Martin Luther King, and stop talking about how brave John Lewis was and courageous for tackling the civil rights movement head on and taking beatings to the head. If you're so proud of those people and those are the people that you hold up in the public consciousness, then challenge the police. Speak out on the police. Say it. Defund the police. You say everything else, but you're scared to be brave like those you hold up and put out there. Keep those people out of your mouth. You're a coward, Cory Booker. Jamal, I get it. I get why he's not going to say it. But again, this is why I'm not a Democrat. This is why people should not be part of the Democrats. We need bold leadership. This is an inflection point in history, unlike any that I've ever seen in my life. Say defund the police, Cory Booker, or give us something beyond just these platitudes and this love and blah, blah, blah. I can't take it anymore. It just drives me nuts.
This is why you're not a Democrat. And I think this is why, as we were speaking to Margaret Kimberly, it is important to be outside of the political system. Fact of the matter is, Cory Booker can't say that. Jake Tapper, Cory Booker in that moment could believe everything that Cory Booker is saying out of his mouth. He could never say defund the police, because immediately after, his opponent is going to say he's trying to get rid of cops. And there is a 70% that's comfortable that says we like those cops. Now, that's kind of the position that the mayor was in. That's the position that Booker is in. The catch is they need to figure out the language to make this work. Because ultimately, this is a political language issue. Defund the police is bold, it's aggressive, it feels great. But the question that the people are going to ask, what comes after? And the defund is this kind of snapshot, even though, yes, there's more to it than that. But the more to it than that have to be explained. But Booker doesn't have the capability of making that explanation in a way where he could satisfy both sides. The side that says something needs to be done with these cops, which is outside the political space, versus there's a comfortable section that is voting for me, that would vote me out of office, and my opponent will say bad things about me and saying that I am trying to get rid of cops off these streets. And there's some streets in Jersey that those people are going to feel some kind of way about. And again, you have a comfortable, let's say, middle class, just like in Bolivia or just like in any of these other countries, who have a relationship with the cops that is not antagonistic. You're just talking about basically the poor and people of color. And so that question becomes, all right, Cory Booker, how do you make this work in a way where you deal with the real material concerns of the poor and the people of color dealing with cops, while simultaneously not saying anything that is going to freak out this constituency that you need to vote? It's a quagmire. That's why you're out of politics, so you can make those arguments.
I hear what you're saying. I would mention there's plenty of poor black people that live in quote unquote violent manufactured poverty that has led to violent communities that also want the police. So it's not as straightforward as I think a lot of people think. It's like police or against police is very complex and nuanced for specific reasons, and that's why police are still in office. But again, Jamal, I think by trying to work around it, to try to get cute with the language, to try to like tiptoe it, the Democratic Party is just going to absolutely embarrass themselves. There was one former council member looking to run again, and he was like, he was text messaging people trying to get a feel for if he should run or not. And he's basically saying, like, we should have the ability to breathe and have statehood, breathe and have equitable health care, breathe. And he was using all the language from the movement. This guy was one of the most corrupt politicians. He was stealing money from the black community when it came to giving it to wealthy businesses and not reinvesting it in local communities. He went to the Chamber of Commerce to run the chamber, bankrupted, and now he's going to basically try to co-opt the language. We're also now seeing the Kamala Harrises of the world, the Cory Bookers of the world, putting out a bill now in Congress to rein in bias and excessive force in policing. But then you have Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer taking a knee with Kente cloth. Well, none of that's the answer either. They're all going to do the performative stuff. So it's almost kind of a rebuttal and pushback towards the Black Lives Matter and the protest community by saying, we're not going to take your language to fund the police. We're going to come up with our own. It's not going to mean anything. It's going to be symbolic. And at the end of the day, it's not actually going to help us win anything. I mean, that's the thing I don't get, Jamal. Like, I understand what you're saying where, we got to play this comfortability thing. But people are going to vote these people out regardless if they say defund the police or not. They're going to see them as Democrats and they'll pick the Republican. I just think the Democrats have no political savvy or any way to calculate. I mean, Rahm Emanuel has some of the most savvy amongst them, and he'll probably say defund the police the next week, while these other Democrats, I just don't know what Cory Booker is thinking. Come out and be bold right now if you want to be that person, but instead they constantly play, let's have a beer summit, drink beer with the other guy, and like everything will be okay.
I'm going to say something shocking to you, and you're going to be like, wow, I can't believe you said that. And you're going to be like, because to me, this is more important than defunding the police. I would make the case of saying reparations. Now, the reason I would say that is because typically I would say politically that doesn't work. But you're at an inflection point. Like your society right now, Black, white, gay, straight, trans, all in the streets. They're not going anywhere. That demand is not there. Now, the catch becomes, yes, I understand it's police brutality. By the same token, if you're really asking about police brutality, you're really getting at, why are they there? Like you said, the cop thing is a complicated question, but part and parcel to that is the structural things that allow society to have communities that are poor, where you're there over-policing and where those cops and crime propagate. Deal with that. When you have like this weird schism in the amount of wealth that one section of your society has versus another. And then the society is saying, yes, 80-something% of those protests are legit. That's an amazing number when you're getting for protests. And so the question becomes, all right, if this is really going to be a black thing, if they're trying to make it that way, fine, deal with that. And one of the main key things of that is poverty, from the vestiges of slavery that you can go back and look at and see going all the way up to the 60s and the 70s. Maybe this is the time to make that argument in regards to a white community saying, we want to end this, and we're looking for a pathway.
Wouldn't that have been funny if Cory Booker said, I'm not going to say defund the police, but, reparations, everyone. That would have been...
No, the question is, what would Jake Tapper have said here? Like, this is one of those things I honestly...
Well, it was Chuck Todd, obviously. It was Chuck Todd, and Chuck Todd would have kind of slackjawed and gone to commercial as quickly as possible.
He might have, but think about it for the moment. If the Democratic Party say, you know what, we're going to fix the reparation stuff. We're sick of this poverty. Do you honestly believe that the white community in the society would say, yeah, screw that? Maybe, but for the first time in my life, I may think maybe not. I could be wrong.
Yeah, well, I got to imagine a reparations conversation here in the next week is coming back to the forefront, unlike ever before. Jamal, we have one last clip here for you. I got to come at my guy, Chuck Todd, here. He's not only the host of Meet the Press, he is also the political director for NBC News, meaning that he has a say of who comes on Meet the Press to talk about politics for the network. And this week they chose to have on the show Kristen Welker, NBC News White House correspondent. And listen here, Jamal, to the hard-hitting, in-depth, insightful hot takes being offered by Chuck Todd and his team. Chuck Todd asked Welker about the latest job numbers and what Trump will look to do with the messaging. Have a listen.
Right. And White House officials, Chuck, are saying the bottom line is that it is remarkable that we are seeing these signs of recovery at this point. And so you can expect the president to continue to try to focus on the numbers that are moving in the right direction, because the economy is going to be key to his reelection. And that's why you had that Rose Garden event on Friday with the president essentially taking a victory lap, Chuck. But I'm told that the Biden campaign, the former vice president, is going to focus on this as well. You can expect to see a number of events in the coming days and weeks focused on his plans for the economic recovery.
Jamal, what kind of hellhole of idiocracy have we fallen into? They literally said, I think Donald Trump is going to focus on the economy, but twist, Inside News says Joe Biden also to focus on the economy. Jamal, it's just so dumb at this point. I mean, this is our mainstream media. This is the #1 watch talk show in America on Sundays. I'm guessing at it. I could be wrong on that, so that's fine. You can correct me if you want. But it just seems like we've gotten to a point where the mainstream media has just gotten so dumb, cannot cover anything with any seriousness because the system's collapsing, and they're so reliant on the system to be where it is. They're all of their corporate donors, all of the Boeings, all of the military industrial complex that pay for them. Those companies are scrambling right now, and they fear the American public, and all they can do is just give us this dribble.
And, there's also this issue that when they're looking at the world, these guys are looking tens of millions of dollars a year. Like, their reality is different from the reality of people who are pillar to post, barely making ends meet. And so they don't get it entirely. They don't even know how to pierce that. Like, if you're looking at something and you're trying to analyze it and figure out the experience that thing is having, well, by definition, you're outside of that thing, trying to figure that thing out. Well, these guys are living in a bubble. They don't function in the way that we do in a society, in the way that we do. There's a different world.
Jamal, with that, we do need to take a quick breather. I need to read a book or something to get away from all the dumbness, just to refuel my brain here with a quick break. That was our weekly Miss the Press segment on Political Misfits, and as always...
You, Chuck Todd.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this
this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the critical hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlieber here, sort of kind of with Jamarl Thomas. Just a few minutes left here before By Any Means Necessary comes on after us. Jamarl Thomas, we have choices for you to make where we go with our stories. Do you want New York, New Zealand, new economy numbers, or new investigations?
New economy numbers.
New economy numbers. The U.S. economy has officially entered a recession in February, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, which announced that a 128-month expansion officially ended. Then the expansion, which had begun in June 2019 after a recession, was the longest on record. Jamarl, I feel like so much of the conversation is this obsession Americans have with growth. And I think this was a conversation that boiled down here in Washington, D.C. as the pandemic took hold, that these developers in the city who have been just making handfuls of money, millions of dollars over the last decade, were flipping out saying, wait a second, we're not going to make our profits. And it's just this assumption that if you just grow, you always have to grow. And you're saying to these developers, like, you guys just had like several good decades where you made multi-million-dollar contracts. You own a ton of land in the city. You own a ton of buildings in the city. You've displaced all these black people. Like, yeah, how about for the next year or two, you guys don't grow and you actually lose a little bit. Everybody else has been growing. So maybe the economy doesn't always grow. And I think it's just this dumb mindset that economic growth is the only imperative. Endless consumption, it's killing our planet. So you know what? If a repression, if a recession has started, obviously I'm afraid for people. I know people are stressing out, and I don't want to put that aside. But that aside, come on now, we can't always be growing if it means destroying our planet.
We take a weird policy position from the standpoint of the public, where we have all of these incentives that drive behaviors. And one of those incentives is basically infinite growth, something that is imaginary. Nothing grows in infinite terms. Everything dies, everything falls. And yet we would take it as a position that some company or something that you're doing needs to grow forever, regardless of the consequences, regardless of who it injures, regardless if there are positive or negative results from that. It doesn't matter. That's what we want. And it becomes like even to the point of saying, hey, let's make sure your employees, the people who actually make your company a company, get higher wages. And they would get punished on the stock market for doing so. How weird is that? What kind of incentives are you putting in a system where paying the people who actually make that work gets penalized? Like, those are just like defects that we consider to be the most natural thing in the world. Yeah, it's a weird thing to grow infinitely, and there are negative consequences of that. And those are things that we deal with every day in regard to the consequences. I agree.
Yes. Speaking of consequences, the New York Times week-long meltdown over Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton's op-ed, "Send in the Troops," has resulted in the resignation of the editorial page editor, James Bennett. As people remember, Tom Cotton put out the letter last week in the New York Times basically saying now is the time for the Insurrection Act. If you want to quiet these protesters, we need the military. At first, there was a virtual walkout amongst New York Times staff writers, and now the editorial page editor, James Bennett, resigning after it comes out that they basically said, Bennett had said, look, we just published it. We went too fast. We fast-tracked it. We didn't have time to properly vet it. And Tom Cotton, Jamarl, said, no, actually, we had 3 different drafts of the letter, and it was the New York Times who pushed us on the Engel, sent in the troops. Quite hilarious here, the New York Times. What a fiasco. I mean, these are the people that the national populace looks to for information every day, and it comes out that they were the ones that pitched that angle, according to Tom Cotton. I obviously don't believe Tom Cotton for much of anything, but if it's him versus the New York Times, I'll believe neither.
That's too funny. Oh, that's too funny. Because initially, like you said, initially it was that the Tom Cotton pitched that story. Then it became, well, no, New York Times pitched that story to me. And then you found another article that Tom Cotton had written that apparently that was just as unhinged, that nobody had an issue with. Yeah, they pitched the story. Like, whatever that story being unhinged or anything else, is it wrong for him to put an unhinged story into the New York Times? I guess that's the thing that I'm more curious about. I mean, if Tom Cotton, whether he's putting that in the Times or whether he's doing that in Congress, he is unhinged. And if that political position that he put in on the New York Times was so unhinged that they had to take it off, what does it say for about him in Congress? And for that matter, if there are people who say this is the political position we want to be espoused, is it wrong for the New York Times to run it?
Yeah,
like I mean, those are valid questions, right?
Plenty of controversy, and a lot of people reading that last two pieces of news. New Zealand is lifting its coronavirus restrictions now that they have no active COVID-19 cases in the country. Congrats to them. And prosecutors formally request to talk with Prince Andrew in the Epstein investigation. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. We got to get out of here for today. Big thank you to our guests, Gustavo Vargas, Margaret Kimberly, and Dr. Joseph Richardson. Thank you, as always, to Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, and Saul, and the entire Sputnik News team. And shout out to our producer, Michelle Whitty. On behalf of Jamal Thomas and myself, Bob Schlehuber, thank you for listening. Now get back to organizing.
Guys, as always, I appreciate you guys for showing up. 12 to 2. We are still clearly doing this remotely, but at some point I suppose we'll be back in the office. Let's see, who's here? We have Sasha NYC. Defund the police as soon as possible. Make them redo the budget. Yes, make them redo the budget. Now, the graphic that I was showing, I think I still have up, was trying to show how much money the police budget has in comparison to other things. Look at that. 115 billion with a B, CDC 11 billion, EPA 9 billion, FEMA 3 billion, OSHA 558 million. Show me your wallet, I will show you what you prioritize. Just think. Just think. We talk about police violence, and we talk about the violence and brutality that the police puts on people and everything else. Even all the crime and whatever is in your society. But for the moment, think about how much violence it takes just to maintain your society the way it is. Meaning, if you're spending this much money for order, why does your system have so much disorder? And is there a way potentially to bring down the chaos organically as opposed to having to throw in cops, maniacs, to hold the line? Your issue is that you drain your system of resources. So human beings and the things that they need to grow to be productive as human beings, you can statistically see it from the standpoint of impoverished communities, whether it's the health outcomes, the life expectancies, all of those things. Those things are there for you to see from a statistical standpoint. It's not magic. But the political system has no ability to deal with those things because they don't want to say Jeff Bezos will not be a trillionaire. Jeff Bezos may get $2 billion, but the society is going to be healthy. It's going to be happy. There's not going to be anybody going without food. People who are ill are going to have health care without having all of this debt on their backs that's eating into their lifespan. We're going to have a society because we prioritize human life. You could do that where you don't have to be spending this much money on your police budget. If you're looking for a demand, I suggest that the demand you're looking for is ending inequality. If you have this many people that are out there marching and stepping, and you're saying those police kill that guy, then your first question is, why is that cop there to put that knee on the throat in the first place? When we get into this issue of defunding the police, that's one end of the equation. The first end of the equation is, why are the cops there? Is there a logic to your society putting those cops there? Is that logic wrong? And if that logic is wrong, why? And is there a way to bring down that organically where you don't necessarily have to have these brutes running through society with guns and with sticks? Those are the questions that should be asked, especially with this many people that are out there marching and protesting. Those are the things that get to the root and the nub of this this quagmire in your society that has all of these people pissed off and marching. Like, share, subscribe. You will see this face a little bit later.